you.
You're welcome. I'd also like to thank Alice Hudson. Alice has been involved in mapping and cartography in New York for many years, and she's been a strong member and supporter of the New York Map Society. She's moving to kind of emeritus status. So we continue to see her. I ran into her about probably a week ago at the opening of the Revolutionary War exhibit at the New York Historical Society. So thank you for your help and your work and your continued membership. So thank you. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Chet.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here again. It's a pleasure always to speak to the New York Map Society. I'll just launch right in. So, with Savage Pictures, fill their gaps on cartographers' fears of blank spaces. So, the phrase that's often used for this is horror vacui, which is Latin for horror or fear of a vacuum. And it comes from the idea that nature abhors a vacuum, which goes back to Aristotle as a principle of physics. But art historians applied it to works of art to express the idea that the artist was afraid of leaving blank spaces on the artwork, whether it's a painting or map or something in another medium. And a definition of horror vacui is the fear of empty space that results in the overmarking of visual space, excessive decoration that threatens to overwhelm what is being decorated, the stuffing of gaps and caesura with further representation. Just to get a proper definition out there. And so I'll begin with a very clear example of horror vacui, which is line fillers, as they're called in medieval manuscripts. So we have here a page from a late 13th century Psalter in Walters in Baltimore. And when the scribe was writing the text and the text was not going to reach the end of the line, he put a decoration there to fill those gaps. So I'll zoom in. We can see that there's a monster or an animal of exactly the right length to fill the line to the end. So whenever the text was not going to reach the line of itself, the artist put in these line fillers. So a clear example of a hesitancy or a fear to leave blank space on a page. Just to look at one more example, again from the Walters, zooming in, we have these wonderful monsters filling the gaps, as it were, at the ends of the line on the pages of this manuscript. So, a number of historians of cartography have bandied about this phrase, horror vacui, but I was intrigued to find that we see here a few scholars who have denied that horror vacui played a role in the designing of maps. And I list their names not to point fingers, but just to say that this is a lively issue that deserves consideration. And what I found is that, or what I couldn't find, was that anyone had really examined the matter. People made claims about it, but I couldn't see anyone presenting the evidence. And that's what I hope to do this evening. So, and I'm going to show maps that seem to me to show horror vacui, but I want to be clear that not all of them do. And even during the same period, some cartographers seem affected by, if we can use that phrase, this fear, others do not. It seems more prevalent in some periods than others. So I'm not making any sort of claim that this is a universal law for cartographers, or that all cartographers were affected by it, but I want to point out that in some cases it does seem to have been operating. So again, I'm beginning with some examples that do not show horror vacui, that is, that have ample blank spaces. So this is an undecorated nautical chart from the early 14th century. It's in the Library of Congress. It's actually the earliest nautical chart in the New World. Nautical charts in their basis and their foundation were practical tools for navigation. The emphasis, we can see, is on coastlines. So we have the coastlines with the place names written perpendicularly to them, but almost nothing in the interior. And if you're sailing in a ship, you don't need to know what's in the interior of the land. So there are different types of nautical charts in effect. nautical chart producers served two very different markets. First, the people who were actually using them to navigate, and second, nobles and kings who were collecting and displaying them. So all of the practical nautical charts looked something like this. They were undecorated. If you were using a nautical chart to go to sea, you didn't need that decoration, you didn't want that decoration. It was extra expense that would not help you navigate. So the practical nautical charts, again, they were very comfortable with leaving blank spaces on those maps. This is an interesting case. This is the Catalanistense Mappamundi of circa 1460. It's based on the nautical chart tradition, and we can see that it's quite elaborately decorated. We can see a number of sovereigns depicted, and so on and so forth. And yet the cartographer was very content to leave this hypothetical southern extension of Africa blank. There's no decoration added there. Another example, staying with nautical charts, this is the Cantino chart of circa 1502. Again, its foundation is nautical chart cartography. And again, it's a very elaborately decorated chart, but we can see there's nothing in the interior of South America and nothing in the interior of Asia. And had the cartographer so desired, there was certainly information available to put something particularly in the interior of Asia. And as we'll see, cartographers were perfectly capable of filling blank space about which they had no information if they wanted to. So in this case, we can see that the cartographer of the Cantino chart was content to leave some parts of the map blank. This is an historical map, which is to say a map that shows the world according to earlier geographical and cartographical ideas. So this is the world according to the Roman geographer Pomponius Mela, made in about 1550, and the cartographer was very content to leave the Southern Ocean undecorated with ships, monsters, flags, so on and so forth. And just to show one other example, a map of North America by Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas, made in 1601, and North America is entirely blank. So again, I'm certainly not trying to argue that all cartographers felt this compulsion to fill maps with decoration. And so in general, we don't have evidence, we don't have statements by cartographers about their philosophy of making maps, at least in the earlier centuries. And so we don't have much in the way of statements about their philosophies of decoration. We don't have statements from many cartographers that say, well, this map, I don't have a lot of geographical information for this area, so I'm going to fill it in. But we do have a couple of statements that point in that direction, I think we can say, and that indicate that this was, this sentiment, this compulsion, this fear was something that cartographers felt. So first are the lines by Jonathan Swift that I quote in the title from 1733 from his On Poetry. So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er unhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns. So this is not a cartographer saying this, of course. This is a poet ascribing this fear or sentiment to cartographers, but it's nonetheless an early piece of evidence that I think points in the direction of the existence of this fear. So 1733, early 18th century. A more compelling piece of evidence comes from Petrus Pontius, his wall map of 1592. So this is a case where a cartographer is talking about this desire to fill things. Just to orient ourselves a little bit, since the map is quite dark, it's difficult to see what's where. So here's Africa. I'm going to look at this part of the chart in the upper right. So there's a chart of the stars of the southern sky, and there's some text next to that, and that's the text I'm going to look at. As we can see, this map is very dark. There's only one surviving exemplar of it, which is in a small institution in Spain. It's quite a challenge to get from that institution even an image this good. So reading the text would be a challenge, but by a remarkable coincidence, Thomas Blundeville wrote a book, his exercises, in 1594, so 2 years after the publication of the map, in which he translates all of the text on the map. So part of the book is titled A Plain and Full Description of Plantius' Universal Map. And so fortunately he translates for us the Latin text on that part of the map. And his translation reads, "Lest the south part of this hemisphere or half globe should remain void and empty, I have taken these southern stars out of the observations of Andreas Corsalius Florentine and have diligently compared the same with the writings of Americus Vespucius and Petrus Medina and have reduced the said stars into this form or shape." The important part is the first phrase, "lest the south part of this hemisphere or half globe should remain void and empty." So a cartographer stating very clearly that he did not want to leave a hemisphere of this celestial map blank. So he did research to find stars from the southern hemisphere that he could place on that map. So a very satisfyingly clear, I think, statement that filling blank space was a concern to at least some cartographers. Another question that needs to be addressed is, whose fear was it of blank spaces? Was it really the cartographer or was it the client? And so I'm thinking here specifically about commissioned nautical charts. So, and what I'm going to do is compare nautical charts by the same cartographer. So this is a nautical chart by Guillaume Soler, made in 1385, and this is an essentially undecorated chart. I'm going to switch to a chart by the same cartographer from the same period, which is heavily decorated, but while we're looking at this chart, I want to point out that it does not include the Nile, it does not include the Red Sea, it does not include the Danube, it does not include images of cities, it does not include flags indicating political control. So this is the sort of undecorated chart that might have been taken to sea, at least towards that end of the spectrum. And what I want to do is point out that this same cartographer would offer charts at every price range. So it's something that makers of luxury goods continue to do today. If you walk into a Porsche showroom, you can buy a Porsche starting at, let's say, $57,900, all the way up to $998,000. And for each model, there's a great variety of options. The idea is that anyone who walks into their showroom, they want to offer a product at whatever price range that customer is comfortable with. And it was the same with nautical charts. There were many different options, and the commissioner of the chart could choose. So here, switching to another chart by Guillaume Soler, made in about 1380, we can see here we have the Red Sea, which we did not have on the other chart. You wouldn't think that the Red Sea would be an option, but it was. We have the Atlas Mountain chain in North Africa. Again, it's a geographical detail you wouldn't expect to be optional, but it was. The Danube, the Alps, all of these flags and coats of arms indicating political control, which did not appear on Soler's other chart. So what this means is there was, like buying a car today, there was a blizzard of options, and the person commissioning the chart could choose. And it took time, artists' time to paint all of these flags and coats of arms. Also, we have descriptive text that did not appear on the other map. We might expect that the descriptive text to tell about the different regions or peoples on a map would be an integral part of a map. Why would you leave them out? He left them out of his other chart because the client wasn't paying for them. We're going to look at another pair of charts, very similar. So here we have a nautical chart by Battista Beccari, 1435. This is relatively undecorated. It's not completely undecorated. There's a few images of cities here and here. But compared to the chart by Beccari that I'm about to show, it's relatively undecorated. And again, my point here is that someone commissioning a nautical chart could choose the level of decoration. So here's the other chart by Beccari from 1426. We have the Atlas mountain chains, which we didn't have in the other chart, the Alps, the Danube. We have the coat of arms of the person who commissioned the map. You might think that if you're paying to have a map made for you, they would throw in the coat of arms for free. That was not the case. You had to pay separately. Ships in the Atlantic, another optional element. Animals and people. And all these flags and coats of arms indicating political control. So when we see a heavily decorated map, what I'm driving at is the question arises, was it just that the person commissioning the map ticked all the boxes, said, give me everything, or was it that the cartographer felt this compulsion to fill blank spaces? So that's a difficult question. And I think we can try to get at it by looking at this image of Central Asia on the Catalan Atlas of 1375. So this is one of the most elaborately decorated nautical charts to have survived from the Middle Ages. We can see the images of sovereigns, many images of cities, ships, mountain chains. But I would suggest, and it's hard to be entirely certain in these matters, but there are blank areas on this map. I'm not feeling here this absolute compulsion to fill every corner of the map with decoration. So I think there are maps in which the person commissioning the map took all the options, and yet the cartographer himself didn't feel this compulsion to fill absolutely every square centimeter of the map. But let's go on and look at some examples where I think horror vacui is in operation. So this is a map of East Africa, India, and the Indian Ocean by Lopo Homan, 1519. And we can see it's very busy indeed. And if we go through the different decorative elements on it, we can see there are images of cities. One might argue that the cities convey geographical information, but the cartographer might just have placed the names with a dot if the decoration was not part of the equation. And we can see that these are very elaborate images of cities. We have these trees, which I think we can say are fairly gratuitous. Animals, images of people, images of ships. And if we put them all together, we can see how densely this map is decorated. And there's really very little, there's very few parts of the map that are not either dense with geographical knowledge or dense with decoration. So we look at the world map by Diogo Ribeiro, 1529. So just to orient ourselves, here's Africa, here's South America. I want to look at the Pacific. So we have these large illustrations of navigational tools, cartouches, compass roses, ships, wind heads in the corners. And if we put them all together, the Pacific is quite full, even though there's very, very little geographic information conveyed in the Pacific. That is, there's very little in the way of islands. So we get a sense that the cartographer is filling what would otherwise be blank space. Caspar Vogel's world map of 1558, the unique surviving exemplars at Harvard. Again, we'll look at the Pacific. So we have long descriptive texts. So these might have making a map is a series of choices. So these descriptive texts might have been put elsewhere. They could easily have been put in the margin of the map, for example. We have sea monsters, we have ships, and we put them all together and we can see that the Pacific is very dense with decoration. In fact, the only real sort of geographical, cartographic information are these islands. So the percentage of the Pacific that's occupied with decoration as opposed to geographical information is very high.
You'd miss the islands. You would miss the islands if you didn't navigate. You wouldn't find
That's
them.
right. So Paolo Forlani's world map of 1565, I want to look at the southern continent. So this southern continent is entirely hypothetical. There's not any sort of pre-discovery of Australia or Antarctica or anything like that. And we see this web of mountain chains in the southern continent, totally hypothetical. And that web-like quality seems designed to fill that landmass. And then in addition to the web of mountains, we have these animals placed there. And these animals are purely decorative. There are camels and lions, things that could never survive in a cold climate. Giuseppe Rosaccio's world map of 1597. Again, we'll look at the southern continent. I've highlighted, just for clarity, the northern limit of the southern continent. And we have a text about Europe and text about Africa. And I think we have to see that those texts were very carefully planned, particularly the one about Europe, to fill that space. And that didn't happen by accident. And then we have these ethnographic scenes that pertain to the other part of the map. So the southern continent is filled with information that pertains to other parts of the map. The argument could be made that the cartographer is taking advantage of blank space to include information on the map. And I think that's certainly part of what's happening here. But at the same time, I would suggest that the cartographer was hesitant to leave this space blank, to admit that there was just no knowledge about the interior. Moving to the eastern part of the map, we see something very similar, descriptive text about the New World and about Asia, and then ethnographic scenes that again pertain to other parts of the map, and together these texts and scenes fill the southern continent. Mercator's map of Europe, 1572. So the one piece of cartographical information we expect to see in the Atlantic, the British Isles is there, but really the whole rest of the Atlantic is entirely filled. So we have cartouches, we have sea monsters, we have ships, and we put them all together and we see that there's very little space that remains outside of the British Isles. And again, everything we're seeing here was a choice on the part of the cartographer. All of this information could have been disposed differently on the map. Joan Martinez, map of Europe and North Africa, 1587 in the National Library in Madrid. This is a particularly interesting case, I think. So this is based on nautical chart traditions. So there's no need really to put any geographical information in the interior of the lands, but we have these names of the continents, which on the one hand are helpful. They convey geographical information, but these elaborate banners seem designed to consume space. We also have some compass roses, and then we have 4 scales of miles. It's the same scale. Some cartographers include different scales of miles, Italian miles, Spanish miles, or leagues. These are all the same, and the elaborate ribbons seem designed to consume space, to avoid absolute emptiness, and just the mere repetition to have 4 when really only 1 would have been necessary is quite gratuitous. Jan van Linschoten's map of West Africa and the Southern Atlantic, 1596. So we have these texts and inset images. They're surrounded by these elaborate cartouches, which take up vastly more space. We have some ships, compass roses, and a different way of consuming space on a map. This very florid writing. These names could have been written without these ribbon-like appendages that seem designed just to take up space in the ocean. put them all together, and there's really very little blank space left in the southern Atlantic. Taton's A Map of the Pacific, 1600, another great example of florid writing used to consume space that would otherwise have been left empty in the ocean. And I think it's interesting here to zoom in, and we can see that the word Pacific there is not as florid as the other words. Why is that? Well, because it was a sea monster taking up some of the space that would have otherwise been occupied by that florid writing. Andreas Holmum's World Map 1559 in the National Library in Paris. I want to look at the South Pacific. So we have some compass roses, a sea monster and a ship, and some names of seas. These, of course, convey geographical information. But then we have the letters of the tropic and the indication of the south there are written very large and are spaced out as if on a grid, so as not to leave any substantial part of the map of the ocean empty. And he pursues a very similar strategy in the South Atlantic. So some compass roses, ships, sea monsters, the names of the seas, which again are helpful, it's geographical information. But then the way he writes the names of the Tropic of Capricorn and so forth, and the Arctic Circle, or the Antarctic Circle, seem designed to they're large and spaced out in a way so as not to leave any substantial part of the ocean or the map blank. Willem Blau's Wall Map of the Americas, designed in 1608. This is a later edition by Pietro Tedeschi, 1673. We zoom in on the map proper. So we have some substantial inset maps, some large cartouches, compass roses, native peoples in boats, European ships, and sea monsters, deities, and sovereigns. Taken all together, they fill the ocean. It's a very dramatic example. And of course, they fill the northern part of North America. And this is another case where I think the cartographer was putting that inset map there so as to conceal the fact that he didn't have information about the interior of the continent. The Wall Map of the World by Peter van der Heer, 1611, the unique surviving exemplars in the Sutro Library in San Francisco. If we zoom in on the map itself, so we have these enormous cartouches and inset scenes. And I'll just zoom in on the one in the Southern Ocean. So it's this gallery of famous astronomers, mathematicians, and cartographers, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, Ortelius, and so forth. And it's perfectly designed to fill the Southern Ocean. Going back to the whole map, so again, we have the cartouches and inset scenes, compass roses, and they're not systematically located on the map. They're where there was space that would otherwise not have been filled. Sea monsters, ships, put them all together, and the oceans are impressively occupied on this map. Now I want to look at some cases. We've seen a number of examples where the cartographers seem particularly interested in filling the seas or oceans with decoration. And I want to look at a few cases where the opposite was the case, where the cartographer was interested in filling the lands, but seems to have desired to leave the sea empty. So this wonderful map of the Mediterranean by Giovanni Battista Cavallini, 1640, in the Library of Congress. So I've indicated here the outlines of the Mediterranean, and we can see that there is no decoration in the Mediterranean itself. But the lands of Europe and North Africa are abundantly decorated. So here we have cities. Again, cities, the locations of cities convey geographical information, But the cartographer could have done this just by putting the names of the cities in a dot. And there can be no pretending that these are images of the cities taken from reality. They're just generic images of cities. 2 large inset maps, many compass roses, and again, the size varies according to the space the cartographer desired to consume. 4 scales of miles, gratuitous mountains and trees. There is the chain of the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, but these do not seem designed to follow the track of the Atlas Mountains closely at all. And we put them all together, and again, the lands are heavily occupied with decorations, but the sea is left entirely empty. It's tempting to think that this is that Cavallini was thinking about the original purpose of nautical charts, which was to navigate at sea. So leave the sea blank so that hypothetically someone could use the chart for that purpose, even though a chart this heavily decorated was never going to be taken to sea. Another similar example by Joan Oliva, 1555. This example is at Yale. I don't think I need to circle all of the decorative elements in this example. We can see that, again, the Mediterranean is left empty, and the lands are filled with some of the same images, inset maps, compass roses, images of sovereigns, images of cities, and so forth. Again, just to indicate the outlines of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Nautical chart by Franciscus Oliva, 1661. Very similar. The lands are occupied by what are largely totally gratuitous decorations. Again, just to indicate the outlines of the Mediterranean. This is another map in the same atlas, and this one is interesting and puzzling at the same time. So here's Spain, just to orient ourselves. Here's the Atlantic coast. So in this case, we have abundant decoration in Europe and in the Atlantic. So while in this atlas he left the Mediterranean empty of decoration, he was very content, evidently, to decorate the Atlantic. And I do not fully understand that. Maybe the thought was that the client wasn't interested in navigating in the Atlantic. I don't understand that. But maybe perhaps it's just there was more of a tradition of leaving the Mediterranean blank because most nautical charts focused on Mediterranean navigation, but again, I'm not sure. Jaime Olive's nautical chart made in 1572. So we're seeing the west coast of Africa here. And just to look at some of the decorative elements, so we have kings, cities, gratuitous mountains, really no attempt to correspond with reality at all. Gratuitous trees, Ethiopia spelled in very large letters. Put them all together, and the land is impressively dense with decoration, but not the sea. Map of the Atlantic from Robert Dudley's Arcano del Mare, 1646. So there is some geographical information here. We have the Azores, Newfoundland, and the Grand Banks. Most of the ocean is consumed, if we can use that phrase, by indications of currents and the declination of the compass. This is useful information, but we again have this very florid writing, which actually makes that information much harder to read than it would have been otherwise. So why would the cartographer make this difficult to read? There must have been some other motive operating here, and I think it was a desire to fill space. Costi e Miranda's map of Western Europe, Africa, and America in the British Library. If we zoom in on Africa, so we have this huge compass rose occupying the central part of the continent, and these chains of mountains that bear no connection with reality whatsoever. I don't even think it would be, you can't even try to persuade yourself there's an attempt to follow reality here. So it's all decoration designed to fill the land. We zoom out. This case, so these are ships. In this case, seems similar to the web of mountains in the southern continent, one of the maps we looked at earlier. The ships are evenly spaced in what seems to be a desire not to leave any really large portion of the ocean empty. And then in the southern Pacific here, this wonderful example of floored writing designed to consume space. So Mar del Duzer, so it's Portuguese for the Pacific, it's essentially unlegible. The lettering is so florid, and despite its great size, so 3 words occupy a substantial portion of the South Pacific, it's very difficult to read. So again, legibility and conveying information was not the priority here. There were other forces at work. So I think it's fair to say that in the 16th and 17th century, some cartographers, again not all, some were making maps with this horror vacui in operation, that they were feeling this, whatever we're going to call it, fear of blank spaces or compulsion to fill space with decoration. As the 17th and 18th century progressed, I think you can see some signs of the decline of that impulse. And again, I don't want to say that it declined for all cartographers at the same rate, in different regions at the same rate, but I think we can look at a few examples that show that decline. So here's Sanson's map of North America, 1650. Sanson was famous for advocating a more scientific cartography, and we can see that he was very comfortable leaving the northwestern part of North America entirely blank. Frederick de Witt's world map, 1660, we can see that the borders are very, very elaborately decorated. But that's not the case with the map. He was very happy not only to leave the northwestern part of North America blank and undecorated, but the oceans as well. So this is a change from what we've seen earlier. So I'm going to look at 2 or 3 maps from Joan Blau's Atlas Major of 1665, where I think we can see this transition in operation, as it were. So this map, his map of Africa, in the oceans we see some of the decorations we've viewed earlier in maps where horror vacui seem to be in operation. So the ships, the sea monsters, so on and so forth. But other maps in this same atlas show a distinct lack of this concern, a perfect contentment with leaving enormous stretches of both land and sea blank. And looking at the world map in that same atlas, oops, I'm sorry, we see a few ships, but really not very many. The whole entire southern ocean is blank. And again, I think this atlas shows a transition. We see some elements of horror vacui, but fewer than in earlier maps, even by cartographers in the Blau family than we saw earlier. This is Suter's map of Africa, 1730. What I want to point out is that the interior of the continent is filled with geographical detail, absolutely filled with detail. Most of that information came from sources that were not really reliable. And later cartographers recognized that and pulled that information out. And their interest in reliable information, not just any information, but reliable information, was such that they were content to leave blank spaces rather than commit to something that they didn't trust. They were content to leave blank spaces. So here's Danville's map of Africa, 1749, and he says that he was content to have blank spaces in the map, that he didn't want to trust the earlier cartographic traditions. So So this is a conscious decision to leave blank spaces on the map and be content and even proud of it. And here's Aerosmith's map of Africa in 1802. Again, enormous blank spaces, and the same principle in operation. He would only accept information on his map that came from recent scientific exploratory expeditions in Africa. Nothing else. No Ptolemy, no medieval speculation, nothing. So maps were beginning to acquire this greater scientific prestige, and the cartographers had a greater interest in only conveying what they were absolutely certain of, and if they weren't certain, they would leave it out and were content with blank spaces. So I hope that that this talk will have us come to maps with new eyes, and when we see a map like this, we'll think about something like that and see this principle in operation. And again, I don't want to claim that every cartographer felt this compulsion, that it was in operation throughout the history of cartography, but certainly for some cartographers in the 16th and 17th century, I think it was an important principle in the design of maps. Thank you very much.
I can't help but think that we're not really looking at maps here, but rather the 16th century equivalent of a graphic novel. It's right, one of those pictorial novels that the Japanese put out all the time. Where you spend several days looking at this, soaking it up, enjoying it, thinking about it, discussing it with friends. And yes, there's a map in there somewhere too, but it's more like, if you go to a school, you see the periodic table wrapped in pictures of elements in use and then carry test tubes and stuff like that. It's not really a map. I mean, there's a map there, but it's got another purpose.
I would disagree with that. I think the maps I've shown are maps.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think there's any escaping that. So the question becomes, where did all this decoration come from, and what purpose was it serving?
Well, Chet, I think the gentleman's point is that maybe the totality of what's produced is more than a map. It's an experience.
Sure.
And I wasn't thinking so much of the sort of narrative he was talking about, but I was thinking more of the aesthetics involved in the map. And I think that many of the maps that you showed were aesthetically not very pleasing, but several of them were extremely pleasing. And I'm just wondering, has there ever been much study done on the aesthetics of maps, and how they sort of reflect the time that they were produced and so on?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
So since the quote that you started with from Jonathan Swift was from 1733, so he must have been an admirer of antique maps.
I think so, yes.
Because when he wrote that, there was already the shift starting.
Yeah, right, exactly. And yeah, maybe admirer isn't the right word. He was certainly conscious of them. When he writes those lines, I don't know that he's exactly endorsing this idea of putting elephants where you didn't have knowledge, but he was certainly conscious that that was a principle in operation.
Has he published this article?
No, I haven't. That's his new material.
We're looking for it. What got you started on this topic? Was there a particular map that you looked at and you wondered why?
I think it was more an accumulation of looking at some 17th century maps recently and thinking about the idea of hor vacui and realizing that although the idea is mentioned, I couldn't think of anyone who'd actually shown evidence either way. And then I went looking and I still couldn't find any really discussion of it. I could only find people mentioning it and saying either this principle was important or was not, but no evidence. So I thought, well, it would be fun to look at the evidence.
I think it's interesting to see the examples of where there were place names, or the Mar de Sur, which was so big it was rendered illegible. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like, you know, as compared to the decorations on maps that were procured for people that wanted to look a certain way, so they would add decorative elements to it just because they wanted a beautiful map. You know?
Mhm.
Interesting.
When in this time frame did the expression terra incognita start to be used or end being used on maps where they didn't know what was there?
The phrase goes back well before the maps we've seen here. As to when it ends, I would say maybe the 19th century, something like that.
I think you gave this presentation in California not too long ago in the presence of perhaps other map historians. What was their reaction to your thesis?
They seemed to welcome it. That was a shorter version of the paper, so it was, yeah, I don't remember exactly how much shorter, but maybe 30% shorter, something like that. But they seemed to be well received.
Chet, the Yale map had a crucifixion on it. Did you bring that up again?
Sure. Yes, that's right.
It seemed like
In the
a
Atlantic.
rather strange place for it.
West.
There you go.
Yeah, so
You ever seen that before?
I have. So it was traditional to have. So this is it's on parchment. So this is an animal skin, and what we're seeing here is what was the neck of the animal. And it's quite common to have at that part of the map a religious decoration. It could be the Madonna and Child. It could be a saint. It could be a crucifixion, although I'd say that's a little bit less common.
Interesting, I note that the map on the screen right now appears to have been prepared by a female cartographer. In that era, how many were there?
It's actually a man, although
Okay.
it does look like a woman's name. Yes, I'm trying to think female cartographers in the 16th century.
That's Gallus who just.
Yeah, rare. No,
Yeah.
Jonathan.
They were probably more women physicians.
What led you to believe it was?
John.
Joan.
The name Joan.
Okay.
Joan is often a female name.
That's right. We have, I don't know of any female cartographers this early. We have some records of women commissioning maps, queens, for example, commissioning maps, but making maps, nothing comes to mind.
Can't think of any better.
So I'll come back to my point again, and I think you have to look at how they looked at paintings over the same period. And the way they looked at paintings changed.
Sure.
And I think maybe it corresponds to the change you see here.
In what way?
Well, I always think of early Renaissance, late medieval pictures as being more like a movie. There's a story in them. You can actually spend several hours looking in the background and seeing this story and that story. And it's not just Christ after the crucifixion. There's John the Baptist walking in here and Mother Mary here. And it's a movie, albeit not moving. But we live in a time increasingly where paintings simply become an aesthetic merit. You know, they just become beautiful paintings. And you're not going to spend 2 hours working through the backstory of the painting. There isn't a backstory of the painting by the time you get to the 18th century. I'm just thinking, and that's kind of where I was coming from when I made the statement. That the way they looked at paintings changed, and the way they looked at maps changed to correspond.
Yeah, I haven't compared, contemporary changes in paintings. but I think that some of the changes in maps came from a changing idea of what maps should be. So Danville, for example, is very explicit about this change, and so is Aerosmith. We don't have, I don't think, for example, there's a discussion of that, I'm quite sure there's not in the Atlas Major of 1665, but we do have some cartographers discussing this change in maps, this preference for less information and contentment with blank spaces if we really don't know anything about this thing.
I think the analysis of the world maps is, I mean, this was really mind-breaking for me. I found it very fascinating after all the years I've looked at maps, but still. But I'm also intrigued now about, say, what about just maps of France through time and looking at that, maps of France. In the same way, you're going to learn a lot about French history and important people in France who were affecting history. I think this opens a whole new aspect of looking at the history of mapping. It's really fascinating.
Thank you very much, Alice. I mean, as I said at the end, I hope that having looked at some maps this way, you can't unsee that.
Yeah.
And again, I definitely don't want to say that all maps, that this was an operation for all cartographers. Don't want to say it was an operation in all periods, but for some it definitely was. And I think looking at them in that with that lens can be valuable.
I was wondering if all these images were already in your database of images, or whether you had to go out and find images that would support your thesis for this talk. I basically, as I was doing other things, I kept my eye out for examples. And so for this, the question of this example here where the Mediterranean is left empty, there were, I think, 3 other maps that I considered using, 2 of which I obtained images of, but in the end I didn't feel that they illustrated the point quite as clearly. I think they show the same thing, but I think I had, I don't know, 190 slides, and in going through that many images, I don't want examples that are ambiguous, or one of the maps was damaged, and I think that's a little distracting. There's a wonderful example of the Hispanic Society, and I was not able to obtain an image of it, as much as I tried. It's a beautiful example, absolutely magnificent. I could not get an image of it.
Here in New York, or?
Yeah. They wanted, so the map would have to be removed from its case. They would have to bring in a professional photographer, and they said that might cost, I don't know, $550 or something like that, which seemed like a bit much for one slide in the
Right.
presentation.
Is it on display in the society?
To my knowledge, it is not.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was another map you had referenced that was in a small library in Spain.
Yeah.
Which was it? Was it one of your first? It was a kind of a. It looked like a spectral imaging candidate. But
Yes. So the Plancius.
where is that?
It's in Spain. It's in I can look up the name of the institution. It's a small college, and they don't have a large map collection. Somehow, they do have that one. I'll get there soon.
So it wasn't at the Musée Naval or any of those.
No, nothing like that.
There is an exhibition in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid right now. I saw they announced it. It's an interesting thing. You
Mhm.
probably can look at it online if you
Yeah. Here's the map. I mean, I haven't seen it in person, so I don't know what happened in the dark areas there, exactly whether it was a reagent or some sort of original coloring or what, but it is very dark, and looking at it from a distance, it's difficult to see
want. Right.
what's where at all.
Well, I'm glad you brought that back, because I thought the text said that he didn't want to leave the southern continent empty, and yet he places it in the northern.
So it's Yeah.
corner, north.
It's a celestial map.
Right, no, but didn't the text say that something about he didn't want to leave it something empty?
What he doesn't want to leave empty is this map right here. So this is it's a celestial map of the southern sky. And the southern sky at this time was not well known,
You couldn't see it.
but he did research to find information about constellations in the southern sky. So the phrase is here. Lest the southern part of this hemisphere or half globe, that is the celestial globe, should remain void and empty.
I think the reason that they leave the seas blank for an nautical chart is that that chart is used by the navigator to draw lines on it of where he is and where he hopes to be and plot his course accordingly, so he needs the room to draw the lines and be able to see it. And the reason for I think parallel rulers were a pretty old invention. I don't know when exactly, but the reason for more than one compass rose, although I know you only 20, is that you don't have to slide them as far to get to where you want to be.
Absolutely. So
You need a few. Modern
Yeah.
charts have more than one frequently.
yeah, the thing
Paper
is,
charts, if anyone still uses paper charts.
the thing
I
is,
do.
the thing is with the map that I was showing is that it was so heavily decorated,
Right.
it would never have actually been taken to sea.
Right.
But yeah, I agree that the idea in leaving the seas blank had to have been that, sort of a nod to tradition, I guess you'd say.
Does this horror vacuum ever go out of fashion? I mean, obviously, at all times, it seems like they're very ornate maps being produced at the same time as, much less. I know, 19th century, I can't really think of much that's that decorated. I think of sort of Aerosmith, sort of very...
Yeah. So one image I was thinking of using near the end was a modern pictorial map.
Yeah, that's...
So
that's
I
just
think
a
there
really
you can
nice-
see some of this principle in operation.
Mhm.
I should have thrown that slide in. But it's a map that I actually saw there's an exhibition in the map room at the New York Public Library of maps of air travel. And so it was showing, so a bit of the Atlantic, North Africa, and Europe, and then some of Asia, but none of the air routes went into Asia. So in Asia, there was an image of the sun and the moon, and a large airplane, and an inset map, and then one other decorative element. So this decoration's consuming a significant portion of Asia, and then there was also, I think it was a TWA map, there was also a large TWA plane in North Africa. So I think, it could be fun to look at some modern pictorial maps to see this principle sort of coming into play again.
In the 20th century, yeah.
So we're gonna see an article soon.
We'll see an article at some point. I mean, it's a tricky subject to try and publish because it's a very visual subject.
Yeah.
And I've gotten involved in a couple of subjects of that nature, and I'm not, I don't know if I could convince a publisher to allow me 10 images of one or whatever, 6 images of one map, and then I would need to do that several times. So I need to think about the best format to do that. But yes.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Chet. It was very good. I'd like to remind everyone